I will not stand for this mockery of justice. You are nothing but a pawn, and I refuse to be silent.
The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Providence Municipal Court. Catherine Morrison walked in wearing a tailored navy suit, blonde hair pulled back, designer handbag at her side. Everything about her screamed success. But there was something in her eyes, a shadow that makeup couldn't hide. The kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much for too long. She was there for a parking ticket, $75. Most people in her position would have paid it online and moved on, but Catherine showed up in person. And what happened next would remind everyone in that courtroom why compassion still matters. I am Frederick, and I've spent years watching how people respond when the system gives them a choice between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. This case is one I keep coming back to because it shows what happens when someone with every advantage chooses humility over entitlement. The gallery was filled with the usual crowd, elderly regulars who came for the community, a young man scrolling his phone, a tired mother hoping her case would be called quickly. None of them knew they were about to witness something they'd remember for years. Judge Frank Caprio sat behind the bench reviewing the docket. He'd been on that bench for 30 years, and in that time he'd seen every excuse, every shade of human nature. He approached each person with the same dignity, no matter who they were or what they'd done. The bailiff called the case. City of Providence versus Catherine Morrison. Parking violation. Catherine stepped forward. The judge looked up and studied her carefully. He noticed the expensive watch, the quality suit, the designer bag. But he also noticed her hands gripping each other too tightly, the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his. Not from arrogance, but from something else. If you're someone who believes the courtroom can still be a place where people are seen as human beings and not just case numbers, go ahead and tap that like button. Judge Caprio asked the obvious question. She could have paid this online. Why come to court over $75? Catherine said she wanted to explain in person. She believed in taking responsibility, and she thought it was important to do it properly. The judge gestured to the citation. The ticket was issued outside Providence General Hospital on a Thursday afternoon. He asked what happened that day. Catherine took a breath. She was at the hospital with her 12-year-old daughter, Emma. They were there for medical tests. The appointment that was supposed to take 1 hour stretched into 3. By the time she realised how much time had passed, the meter had expired and the ticket was already on her windshield. The judge asked how her daughter was doing, and that's when Catherine's composure started to crack. She explained that they had been waiting for answers for 4 months. Emma had recurring headaches, fatigue, episodes where she just didn't seem like herself. They had been seeing specialists, running tests, trying to understand what was happening. That particular day, the neurologist wanted to run additional tests immediately. What was supposed to be a consultation turned into an afternoon of procedures. Emma was frightened. Judge Caprio listened with full attention. He had grandchildren of his own. The mention of a scared 12-year-old struck something deep. He said quietly that Catherine had been faced with a choice. Stay with her daughter or go feed a parking meter. Catherine nodded. Emma had been holding her hand so tight. The nurse explained what they needed to do, and Emma looked at her mother with eyes trying so hard to be brave, but absolutely terrified. She asked her mum not to leave. She said she was scared. Catherine's voice cracked as she admitted she'd thought about the parking meter. She calculated how long it would take to run downstairs, feed the meter and get back. Maybe 8 minutes, maybe 10. She kept telling herself it was just 8 minutes, that the responsible thing was to follow the rules. But then she looked at her daughter's face and realised no parking ticket in the world was worth leaving Emma alone when she needed her most. So she stayed. She held Emma's hand through every test. She whispered that Emma was brave and strong. She told her stories to distract her from the fear. When it was finally over and they walked out to the parking lot, the ticket was there, and honestly, Catherine said, it felt like a small price to pay for being where she needed to be. The courtroom went completely silent. The young man stopped scrolling. The mother with the toddler had tears in her eyes. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. The judge asked Catherine what she did for work. She explained she owned Morrison Properties, a commercial real estate company. She'd built it over 15 years. They managed office buildings and retail spaces, employed about 40 people. It had been successful, and she was grateful for that success especially now with medical bills mounting. So the $75 fine wasn't a financial hardship. Catherine confirmed that. She could afford to pay it many times over. That wasn't why she came. She believed in accountability. She taught her children that actions have consequences, that they don't get special treatment because of who they are. She'd broken a parking rule, even with a good reason, and she was prepared to accept the penalty. But she wanted the court to understand the context, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. She wanted someone to know she didn't park illegally out of carelessness or entitlement. She did it because being a mother mattered more than being a law-abiding citizen in that moment. And she would make the same choice again. I find myself thinking about how rare that is. Most people who can afford to make problems disappear do exactly that. They don't show up. They don't explain. They certainly don't stand in front of a judge and admit they'd break the rule again. There's something quietly powerful about someone who understands the difference between accountability and justification. Judge Caprio asked her a deeper question. In her business, she dealt with contracts and regulations every day. She understood rules. So what did she believe was the purpose of law? Catherine thought carefully. She said laws exist to create order and fairness, to protect people and keep society functioning. But laws are written by human beings for human beings, and sometimes humanity requires weighing competing values. Following every rule perfectly isn't always the same thing as doing the right thing. The judge nodded slowly. He asked about her family. She'd mentioned children, plural. Catherine's expression shifted. She had 2 kids. Emma was 12. Her son Michael was 15. Good kids, smart, kind, resilient. They'd had to be resilient the past couple of years. And then came the question that changed everything. Where was their father during that hospital visit? The silence that followed felt heavy. Catherine's hands tightened on the stand. When she spoke, her voice was steady but layered with grief. Her husband David had passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. They fought it for 18 months, tried every treatment, but nothing was enough. He died at home with her and the kids beside him. Emma was 10 when she lost her father. She still slept with his old college sweatshirt sometimes, said it smelled like him, though Catherine knew that scent had faded long ago. She thought what Emma really smelled was memory. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Caprio expressed his condolences. That must have been incredibly difficult. Catherine nodded. It was. It still was. David wasn't just her husband. He was her partner in every sense. They built the business together, raised their children together, dreamed together. When he died, she didn't just lose him. She lost the person who shared the weight of every decision, every worry, every celebration. Now everything fell on her shoulders alone. She paused, gathering strength. That day at the hospital, she found herself wishing desperately that David was there. Not to feed the meter, though that would have helped, but just to be another parent in that room, to hold Emma's other hand, to look at her across the hospital bed and communicate without words that they'd get through it together. But he wasn't there. He'd never be there again. So she held both of Emma's hands and tried to be enough. And she accepted that a parking ticket was one of many small prices she'd pay for being a single parent handling what a partnership used to share. Here's what gets me. Grief doesn't excuse you from the mechanics of daily life. Bills still come, meters still expire, kids still get scared in hospitals. And somehow you're expected to navigate all of it with half the support you used to have. I don't think most people understand that weight until they're carrying it themselves. Judge Caprio leaned back, fingers steepled. He told Catherine that people reveal their true character not when everything's going well, but under pressure. She was clearly under tremendous pressure, running a business, raising 2 children alone, managing her daughter's medical situation, yet she came to court not to make excuses, not to leverage her resources, but simply to accept responsibility while providing context. That spoke to who she was. Catherine's eyes glistened. She admitted she didn't feel like a good person most days. She felt like she was barely holding everything together. She snapped at Michael when exhausted. She cried in the car before going into the office so employees wouldn't see. She lay awake at night worrying about Emma's test results and whether she was making the right decisions. She wondered constantly if David would have handled things better, if he'd have known what to say in moments when she felt completely lost. The judge's voice was gentle but firm. The fact that she questioned herself, worried about her children, lost sleep over decisions, that told him everything he needed to know. Bad parents don't worry about being good enough. They assume they are. She was carrying an enormous weight, and from what he could see, she was carrying it with dignity. The parking ticket wasn't a moral failing. It was evidence of a mother making an impossible choice and choosing love over convenience. He picked up his pen and looked at the citation. The courtroom watched in absolute silence, sensing something significant was about to happen. Before making his ruling, the judge asked one more question. If she could go back to that moment, knowing she'd get the ticket, knowing she'd have to come to court, would she make a different choice? Would she leave her daughter to feed the meter? Catherine didn't hesitate. No, she'd make the exact same choice every single time. Some things are worth whatever price you pay, and being there for her daughter when she was scared was worth any fine, any inconvenience, any consequence. She'd choose Emma over that parking meter 1,000 times, because at the end of her life, she wouldn't remember the ticket she paid or the rules she followed perfectly. She'd remember the moments when she showed her children they mattered more than anything else. What would you have done in that moment? Left the hospital or stayed with your child? Drop your answer in the comments. Judge Caprio set down his pen. He told Catherine that in 30 years on the bench, he'd heard every imaginable excuse for parking violations. People blamed the meter, the weather, the city, everyone except themselves. But she wasn't making excuses. She was explaining that she'd faced an impossible choice and chose her child. That wasn't a violation deserving punishment. That was an act of love deserving recognition. He picked up the citation and wrote across it in bold letters, "Dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Applause started with an elderly woman and rippled through the gallery like a wave. Catherine stood frozen, hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She said she didn't understand. She could afford to pay. She came prepared to pay. She wasn't asking for special treatment. The judge shook his head gently. He wasn't dismissing it because she couldn't afford it. He was dismissing it because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about recognizing when a person's heart was in the right place, when the choice they made, though technically against the rules, was morally right. She put her child's well-being above a parking regulation. That didn't make her a lawbreaker. It made her a good mother. And the court wouldn't penalise good parenting. Catherine struggled to find words. Then she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a leather checkbook. The courtroom watched in confused silence as she wrote carefully. When she finished, she tore the check from its binding and approached a bench, holding it in both hands. She asked permission to speak. The judge gestured for her to continue. She explained that he had shown her extraordinary mercy. He dismissed a fine she was fully prepared to pay, and in doing so reminded her of something important she'd almost forgotten in the chaos of the past 2 years. Judge Caprio accepted the check and looked down. His eyes widened. $7,500, 100 times the parking fine. He looked up, questioning. Catherine's voice steadied. After she received that ticket, she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for a long time. She was exhausted from Emma's tests, overwhelmed by everything she was juggling. She looked at the ticket and started crying, not because of the $75, but because it felt like one more thing going wrong, one more consequence of being pulled in too many directions. Then she looked around that parking lot and saw other families. An elderly couple counting change to feed a meter, a young mother with 3 children calculating how much time she could afford to stay with a sick relative, a man in work clothes running to his truck to move it before the meter expired. She realised something. She was breaking down over a ticket she could easily afford. But there were families facing the same impossible choice, and for them, $75 might mean choosing between parking and groceries, between parking and medication, between being present for their family and paying their bills. The check, she explained, was her request that it be donated to Providence General Hospital for a parking assistance fund. No family should have to choose between being with their sick child and affording the parking fee. No parent should have to run out during their child's procedure to feed a meter. No one should face what she faced without the financial cushion that let her simply accept the ticket and move on. The courtroom sat stunned. Judge Caprio stood, a gesture he reserved only for extraordinary moments. The entire courtroom rose with him. He told Catherine that in 30 years he'd never witnessed such grace. She came expecting to pay a debt to the city. Instead, she was paying forward a gift to families who desperately needed it. This was justice paired with compassion. This was privilege used to lift others rather than elevate oneself. She transformed a moment of mercy into a movement of kindness. The gallery didn't just applaud, they gave a standing ovation that felt less like approval and more like gratitude. An elderly man in the third row raised his hand. The judge nodded for him to speak. The man's voice shook as he explained his grandson had spent 2 months in the pediatric unit last year with leukemia. He was fine now, but during those 2 months, his daughter and her husband nearly went bankrupt. Not from medical bills, which insurance covered, but from parking fees, gas, meals, lost wages. They spent over $3,000 on parking alone. Some days they couldn't afford to both park, so his daughter would drop her husband off and circle the block for hours. This woman, he said, gesturing toward Catherine, just gave families like his a gift they'd never forget. Others began speaking. A young mother stood, holding her toddler, pulling a $20 bill from her wallet. It was all she had, but if the fund was real, she wanted to be part of it. Her daughter had surgery last year, and she'd gotten 4 parking tickets in 3 days because she couldn't leave her side long enough to move her car. A construction worker stood. He was in, whatever he could give. His wife and he lived in the Ronald McDonald house for 6 weeks when their son was born premature. They knew what it meant to count every dollar. One by one, people approached, offering what they could. Not large amounts, but genuine offerings from people who understood the weight of medical crises and the burden of small costs that pile up. Catherine watched through tears as strangers united in compassion. Judge Caprio let the moment unfold, understanding that sometimes a courtroom becomes more than a place of judgment, it becomes a place of healing. When the donations finally subsided, he spoke. The court would work with Providence General Hospital to establish the fund immediately. They'd ensure Catherine's donation and all contributions were used specifically to help families during medical crises. And they'd name it in honour of David Morrison, whose values clearly lived on through his wife and children. Catherine pressed her hand to her chest, overwhelmed. She whispered that he would have loved this. He always said success meant nothing if you didn't use it to help others. The judge nodded. Catherine came carrying tremendous weight: single parenthood, medical uncertainty, grief, responsibility. But she also came carrying something else: the understanding that privilege creates responsibility, and that responsibility, when mixed with empathy, becomes transformation. She received mercy and multiplied it 100-fold. That was the mathematics of grace, where one act of kindness creates infinite returns. Her daughter would one day fully understand what happened here. She had learned that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, it's character. It's the willingness to turn your moment of grace into someone else's moment of hope. As Catherine prepared to leave, she turned back. She asked permission to say one more thing. The judge gestured for her to continue. 2 years ago, when David died, she felt like she was drowning. People kept telling her she was strong, but she didn't feel strong. She felt broken. She'd spent 2 years trying to survive each day, to be enough for her children, to keep their lives moving forward. Today, the judge showed her mercy when she expected judgment. He saw past the facts of a violation to the heart of an impossible choice. And in doing so, he reminded her of something she'd forgotten: that the world still has room for compassion, that the law can have a heart, and that even in our most broken moments, we can still do something meaningful for others. Her voice grew stronger. She didn't come planning to donate anything beyond the fine, but his kindness opened something grief had closed. It reminded her that she and David didn't build their business just to accumulate wealth. They built it to create opportunities, to employ people, to contribute to their community. Somewhere in the chaos of loss and fear and trying to do everything alone, she'd forgotten that purpose. He'd given it back to her. If stories like this remind you why humanity still matters, why character still counts, counts, hit that subscribe button because the world needs more people who understand that mercy isn't weakness and that grace, when given freely, comes back in ways you can't predict. Judge Caprio's eyes reflected deep emotion as he delivered his final words. Grief narrows our vision until all we can see is our own pain. But Catherine demonstrated that even in the midst of that pain, even carrying burdens that would crush most people, she still had the capacity to see beyond herself. That wasn't weakness. That was the truest form of strength. Go home to your children, he told her. Tell Emma her mother turned a parking ticket into a legacy. Tell Michael that character isn't about never facing consequences, but how we respond when we do. And know that because of what happened here today, dozens of families, maybe hundreds, will be able to sit with their sick loved ones without the added burden of parking fees and financial stress. She had transformed mercy into ministry, and that was a gift that would echo far beyond this moment. The gavel came down softly, not as punishment, but as punctuation to a story that would be told and retold. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is turn their moment of grace into someone else's moment of hope, and that justice, at its finest, looks exactly like this.